Okay, so we're gonna talk about like just normal training versus training for like maximal weights. So what I mean by that is like, let's say you're just training for some hypertrophy, you're just, doing the bench press, trying to, get a big chest bro. And alternatively, you're getting ready for a powerlifting meet, you're trying to hit massive weights, and you're hitting weights that are 90+% of your 1 rep max. So there's a few key differences in technique, and we can generally apply this to just about any exercise whenever we're trying to like lift really heavy for the purposes of competition versus, you're just standard training, for example. So the main ones are with hypertrophy training, one of the things we usually want to maximize is range of motion. If we're trying to, if we're doing the bench press or something and, we're just trying to, get some hypertrophy, a lot of times we might even use some kind of cambered bar or something that allows us to get a little bit deeper than we would be able to get with a straight bar. We might want to minimize the arch a little bit that we use on the bench press. Different things that are going to allow us to kind of maximize the range of motion during the exercise a little bit to see if we can facilitate a little bit extra hypertrophy, even if it reduces the load somewhat. Now, strength training, we are going to alter our body mechanics in a way that allows us to minimize the range of motion if it suits us. So, especially for something like bench press, we're going to get as big of an arch in the chest as we possibly can so that we can minimize the range of motion on the exercise. So, instead of coming all the way down here and pressing up, you can arch all the way up here and, you can essentially cut the range of motion and, into 2/3 of what it normally would have been, or maybe even half, depending on how big your arch can get. The other aspect to it, so this is one that a lot of trainers talk about, but in a lot of cases it's not necessarily necessary, and it's the concept of stability. So when we look at training with sub-maximal weights, as we would use for like a hypertrophy program, or especially with any kind of like speed development, we don't want to cause any unnecessary extra stability within the body. Whereas, if we're powerlifting or something like that, a lot of times, we're trying to get these, we're trying to brace as much as possible. We're trying to get we're trying to get a lot of intra-abdominal pressure. We're trying to get the whole body as tight as possible and get as many muscles involved in the exercise as we possibly can, because one of the things that benefits strength and allows us to lift bigger loads is the contribution of other muscles, even those that we don't want to consider to be primary synergists within the context of the movement, based on how the muscles attach to one another via the fascial system. And the other aspect to it too is the more stability we can create within the body, the more we can, arch on the bench press, get leg drive within the bench press, yada, 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 that allows us to increase muscle activation. We can ultimately lift a bigger weight, and it also reduces the risk of injury. So, we see this with like squats, deadlifts, etc. And the tighter we can get, especially for movements that have an eccentric component like bench press and squats in a powerlifting context, the tighter we can get, the stronger we can engage those muscles, on that eccentric component of the exercise. The more elastic energy we can try to store, and then, the more weight we'll be able to lift on the concentric portion. Alternatively, when we get into sub-maximal weights, especially for hypertrophy, and especially if we're trying to be very focused with our hypertrophy training, a lot of times this can be counterproductive. A lot of time, so for example, if we're trying to bench press or something, and our primary goal of that exercise is to grow the pectoral muscles, we don't want all the contribution of all these other extra muscle groups that are going to aid in the execution of the exercise. And that's part of the reason why we're going to reduce the load for hypertrophy training as opposed to strength training, because with strength training, we want to encourage the body to use all these accessory tertiary muscle groups in order to aid in the execution of the movement. We want to facilitate those adaptations because it's going to allow us to lift more. But that's not necessarily what we want to do with hypertrophy training. Oftentimes with hypertrophy training, we want to be very focused with our exercise execution, and we want to put as much of the stress of the exercise on the target muscle as possible and reduce the contribution of all those other muscle groups. And second of all, when we're doing these techniques that allow us to create a lot of stability within the body, and we're creating a lot of intra-abdominal pressure, we're trying to create as much stability as possible, we're only doing that for very brief periods of time. We're doing it for the execution of 1 to 3 reps on average. And when you're trying to do stuff like that, where you're trying to do a lot of reps like that, where you're trying to create all this pressure in the body, your blood pressure is going to go through the roof, and it's not necessary. Like, you don't need that much stability to lift a 60% weight. And I've seen this a lot with people that work with kettlebells. They're kind of dabbling towards the higher velocity end of the spectrum, especially those that kind of consider themselves to be part of like the functional fitness community. You see them encourage a lot of you see them encourage a lot of bracing, especially in these higher velocity movements, and that's something you generally don't want. So a lot of these higher velocity movements, and especially when you look at, running, sprinting, stuff like that, one of the key hallmarks of these exercises is the ability to relax and then generate a lot of tension very quickly. Whereas like powerlifting is completely on the other end of the spectrum, where you're trying to maintain a high degree of mechanical stiffness within the body, and you're trying to maintain that for the duration of the lift. Whereas something like sprinting, jumping, all these track and field events, you want the body to relax, have this very fluid, relaxed motion, and then right at the instant where it needs to generate a lot of force, or where the foot comes into contact with the ground, you need the body to be able to develop a lot of stiffness really quickly and be able to store lots of mechanical energy and then release it in a split second. And something where we're trying to, encourage people to brace during things like kettlebell swings a lot. And we're trying to, we're kind of turning the exercise into something that's not really intended to be in the first place. And same thing with hypertrophy and bodybuilding training. So we'll see like with some, especially exercises where we're training for hypertrophy, if you're finding yourself, you're having to brace a lot and you're using a ton of weight, especially if your goal on the exercise is to train a relatively small muscle group, you're probably using a little bit too much weight for that exercise. And you might have a little bit better training economy, just lowering the load a little bit. It doesn't have to be drastic. Sometimes just a 10 or 20% reduction in load is plenty in those cases. And then we normally see a little bit better results, and it's a little bit easier time to facilitate a little bit of extra hypertrophy in the muscle. So, anyways, those are some like key considerations in terms of the differences between training for a movement where we're trying to lift big weights and just regular hypertrophy training. Alternatively, if we kind of continue on down the spectrum, if we kind of go more sort of velocity end of the spectrum, we really want to emphasize that relaxation state. So, anyways, I hope that was helpful. I'll see you guys later.